As you can see by my hat, yes, we are going to be talking about Peter Pan. And yes, I have a Peter Pan hat, and I figured, why not wear this hat for my Peter Pan review? And the cool part is it has my name on the back. I find that so awesome. It's like nicely stitched and everything. So without further ado, let's talk about Peter Pan. Yes, Peter Pan. This is actually based upon a play, actually, written by J.M. Barrie in the early 1900s. And basically, it tells the story of Peter Pan and the Darling family, in particular Wendy, John, and Michael. And basically what I figured I would do for this review is basically just give you a little bit of the sense of the different plots going on in the Disney version and in the original work, and the similarities. And then I will elaborate a little bit on the characters. In particular, for the most part, I found the characters to be relatively the same, for the most part, than how both the works try to portray them. But I will go into some certain specifics that I found to be different, and talk about why certain things are kind of similar. So without further ado, let me discuss the plot. Now, the play opens with Peter Pan flying along the Mr. Darling house, and then he happens to hear upon the stories that Miss Darling, or Mary Darling, the daughter of the 3 kids, who happens to tell the kids tons of stories, and he likes hearing these stories, so he comes every now and again when he stops by the Darling house, like just flying around, and notices them and just kind of sneaks a peek at what they're talking about, and eventually he is spotted, and in the process he ends up losing his shadow. You will notice that this becomes a really interesting aspect in the Disney version as well. And then he tries to reclaim it. And now this is when the Disney version sort of comes in. The Disney version hints that at times that he was there before, but they don't really actually technically show it or maybe really emphasize it. They just start off with the Darlings and introducing them, sort of, so we get a sense of what the family is like. But then it just starts with Peter Pan Peter Pan only shows up to reclaim the shadow, instead of in the play where it kind of plays out the idea that he is actually, watching them, and really observing them, and he really did put a shadow there, or lost his shadow at one point. So basically, due to the fact that, Wendy being the oldest, and then John, and then Michael, she's being the one that's sort of forced to sort of grow up. The Disney version clearly tries to emphasize this. And I think it somewhat tries to emphasize it in the play as well. But I think the play was more focused on the idea of her being sort of the mother figure for, like, the Lost Boys. And that's kind of the reason why Peter decides to have her come along. And then Wendy and her brothers they go along with it, they agree. And basically it's the same kind of thing as the Disney version, they go off and fly, Peter Pan has his companion Tinkerbell too. But sort of when they get to Neverland, it starts out a little bit differently. In the Disney version, they try to introduce us to Captain Hook and the pirates. But in the regular play, or the original work, once they fly to Neverland, or when they're trying to fly there, it's interrupted when the children are blown out of the air by a cannon, and the Lost Boy Toodles nearly kills Wendy. In the Disney version, this sort of plays out a little bit differently. The Disney version, you'll see actually Captain Hook try to get Peter Pan in the beginning and use cannons to do so. And so it's not really the Lost Boys that do the cannon shooting. But once the Darlings sort of, like, Peter Pan just decides for them to go to another location as he tries to kind of distract Hook and his pirates in the Disney version, they try to find some place where they can land, and that's when you get a frontal assault. But it's not necessarily on all the children. It's more focused on Wendy. And again, this does kind of go like Toodles, the character, one of the Lost Boys, pretty much was sort of manipulated by Tinkerbell, and you'll see this in the play pretty much. And ultimately, Tinkerbell's again that same character who's sort of jealous of Peter Pan and Wendy's relationship, and so she tries to kind of mess things up, and ultimately Toodles is the one who sort of fires a cannon at them, at all of them, and ends up resulting in Wendy almost getting killed. And that's, I think, really a major difference that I found. It's just how they kind of introduce everything. It's just a little bit differently structured in the play than it is in the actual story. And then since Wendy is injured in the original play by the fact that she was struck down by a cannon, or just slightly injured by this assault by this particular assault, they basically house her so that she can get better, and then basically during that time Michael and John join the Lost Boys, and then Peter finally invites her into the underground home, and she immediately assumes a maternity, which kind of means like she's like the mother now, the mother figure. So you have that kind of that separation that doesn't really happen necessarily in the Disney version. And in the Disney version, the separation that they do have kind of just plays out differently. You'll notice that Wendy is almost killed, but she's not injured at all or needs to be recuperated or anything. Basically, Peter Pan saves her, and he decides to take her personally off to Mermaid Lagoon to meet the mermaids. And then John and Michael split up with the Lost Boys to go and, search for the Indians. That's how it plays out in the Disney version, for the most part. And that kind of separation just doesn't happen in the original work. In the original work, all of the Darlings go to Mermaid Lagoon, but the mermaids aren't really necessarily the most friendly of people. They're kind of the ones that are just very... You'll see this too in the Disney version, that they're kind of really mean. But I think the original work plays them more as more hostile. And I'll go into this when I sort of explain the characters here. But it's to the point where they will probably, they're really like... They're kind of more on the side of creepy. Meaning that they, kind of seduce victims and don't really like anybody else besides Peter Pan. They'll have that one exception of him, and they'll treat him with respect, but you don't cross the line by bringing anybody else within their scope or range, because once you do, they kind of are just, not really the most friendly to people who are not them or Peter Pan. So For the most part, the mermaids are kind of not treated like that in the original work as like as real prominent characters. I mean, in the Disney version, they're not really prominent, but they're still kind of more there, I think, than the original work tries to. What the original work tries to do, really, with the mermaids. But basically, when they're around this lagoon area, that's where they rescue the Indian princess in the name of Tiger Lily and from the pirates. And then you get a battle with Peter Pan, who fights Captain Hook, like in the Disney version. But again, you have to understand that there is, in the Disney version, that separation going on. Like, Michael and John aren't involved in this, but Wendy is. But Wendy is sort of treated, or put to the side for the most part. And, but Captain Hook and Peter Pan do fight. But it sort of plays out differently in the original version. But in the Disney version, for the most part, Peter Pan pretty much wins the battle. And this is like leads to a bunch of funny slapstick and, you know, all that good Disney stuff. But once, but then Peter Pan is injured, and then in the original work, and then he believes he's going to die, and as he's stranded on a rock and then he's left stranded on a rock, by the rising tide, and as he prepares for death, a bird comes and gives him her nest, and he uses this as a boat to sail home. So yes, again, it in the Disney version kind of played out differently. In the Disney version, he basically, you know, saves Tiger Lily, and then, you know, he and everybody else sort of escapes, Wendy too, you know, just sort of flying away. He is never injured in the Disney version. He's very sort of, I think, really glorified in the Disney version. Like, nothing can really touch him, it seems like. But I found it interesting that the play kind of decided to go that you know, he is weak, he is vulnerable to certain situations. And I thought that was interesting to note. And basically, the whole capturing of John and Michael never happens because, again, they were never separated to begin with. So basically, they have sort of a respect given, similar to in the Disney version, where the Indians sort of are, you know, respecting to the fact that Peter Pan, you know, saved the day. And then basically they decide that it's best to protect his home from pirate attack as sort of a kind of reward given to the fact that he rescued Tiger Lily from the pirates. And then ultimately, there is also a lot of jealousy playing in. Like, Wendy is jealous of Tiger Lily, and same thing in the book, same thing in the film as well. Same thing with Tinkerbell being jealous of Wendy, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of the same, and then ultimately, Wendy, being the oldest, kind of decides she wants to go home, similar to the Disney version, where she kind of goes, you know what, this is really enough for me. I mean, I think it's best that we should go home. And basically, what ends up happening is similar to the Disney version in the sense that Captain Hook does capture Wendy, Darling, and all the other darlings, from Peter's home, from where they're staying at. And then I thought this was also interesting. In the original play, he gives he puts a poison in Peter's medicine. I guess he should take a certain medication. I guess according to Wendy, because he does end up trying to take the medicine later on, and I'll explain this. But in the Disney version, it's different, because in the Disney version, it's actually a bomb that Captain Hook places in the form of a package, sort of addressing it to Peter from Wendy. And I thought that was rather fascinating, how Disney decided, we should just make this a bomb. This would probably be a lot easier. And then, basically, Tinkerbell somehow, it doesn't seem like that the play really explains this, but when Peter awakes, the fairy Tinkerbell tells Peter of the darling's plight, and in an effort to please Wendy, Peter goes to take his medicine. Tinkerbell, with no time to explain, simply drinks the medicine herself and nearly dies. Peter draws out the dreams of the children who are thinking of him, and Tinkerbell is saved. So basically what you have to understand about that is this is where we get the famous kind of part where, they kind of read into the fact that Tinkerbell is dying, and they do the whole thing of like chanting like, I do believe in fairies, Even at one point in the play, sometimes Peter Pan would just tell the audience to say, you believe in fairies, you believe in fairies. It's sort of like to get the audience involved in this like magic-esque type world, and in order for Tinkerbell to be saved, and that's how it sort of plays out. And I always thought that was interesting that the Disney version does not include this. It does not include any of this at all. Basically what happens is that the bomb is set to explode at a certain time, and when the bomb does explode at that certain time, Tinkerbell is left fairly injured. But we never really know what ends up how Peter really recovers her. It just kind of, he's just kind of left with a really broken house because it's a bomb. But he tries to find Tinkerbell, and all we know is that she does have her light, but it's kind of like really fading, and I'm not sure if maybe he maybe just somehow maybe repaired her on his own. The Disney version doesn't really offer an explanation really if Tinkerbell is really injured, or really hurt severely. It just kind of cuts itself, and we don't really offer an explanation to that. So yeah, I think that's kind of one of those things where Disney just decides to kind of do it differently, which I thought was interesting, because I think the Disney version could have kept that in, because that's sort of really prominent. I think it was made in 2003. The 2003 film version still has the believing in fairies part, I believe, for the most part. But yeah, just totally scrapped here. Just not mentioned. But moving on to the what happens in the original work. Basically what happens is Peter encounters Hook's nemesis, the ticking crocodile, on the way to the rescuing the darlings, and learns to mimic its tick. Now, I find this really interesting because the Disney version does include that tick. The tick, 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 tick. Like whenever the crocodile kind of appears, you get that kind of ticking noise. And I thought that was interesting how Disney left that in. And just left it with that kind of sound, like whenever the crocodile comes, it's you know what's happening. But for the most part, that's not how Peter Pan ultimately in the Disney version sort of comes in and gangs up upon Captain Hook and freeing the kids. Disney version totally played out differently. Instead of mimicking a tick of the crocodile, he he kind of scares them or awes them, I'd say, in another way. Basically, how they capture them, how they capture the kids is sort of to sway them to go on to either side or to the pirate side in the Disney version. Ultimately, Wendy personally decides that she does not want to be a pirate. And they say, well, if you don't want to be a pirate, you can just walk the plank. And so basically, as she's going down the plank, she falls, but they don't hear a splash. And then that splash, or that non-existent splash, is a result of the fact that Peter happens to grab her at a point, and then, he sort of hides himself around the ship, and you'll see how they're like, how did she not, why was there no splash? That does not make sense. So he sort of distracts them that way. In the original version, as he is doing this ticking noise, he scares Hook into hiding and rifles Hook's room, looking for the keys to bring to the brig. The pirates hear him, but he fly. But then they hear them and they attack. And then that's when ultimately you get the final battle between him, Peter Pan, and Hook. And ultimately how everything encompasses into this battle is different in the Disney version. And also what you have to understand is in the Disney version as well is that the Lost Boys are also captured. It doesn't really say what really happens in the Lost Boys from what the research that I've done, what really happens to them. But I know that the Darlings are kept captive. And they're not really kept in like a very solid confinement in the Disney version. In the Disney version, they're just kept outside on the deck. And then at one point they're set free in order to, decide whether or not they want to, be pirates or not. It seems like in the original work they're not really given that option. They're just treated as just prisoners and really, really secluded because they're in a brig. But in the Disney version, they're very out there still because, ultimately they just want them to walk the plank. And the funny thing is how Peter sets them free is really ultimately very easy. He just has a little knife and he just cuts the rope that's holding them all together on one of those beams from the ship, which is where everybody else is kind of held captive. And then that's where you get like the ultimate fighting and the ultimate kind of climax to the film, and the ultimate fight between him and Hook. And then basically what happens to Hook is that which ends in ultimately Peter kicking Hook into the jaws of the ticking crocodile. In the Disney version, it's kind of played out differently in the sense the kind of battle. Hook sort of tests him like, don't fly, because it's the only reason how Peter Pan is able to win all the time is because he can fly, and he has that advantage, and Hook doesn't have that advantage. You kind of see how that plays in, but how Peter Pan is ultimately allowed to win in the Disney version. And then he doesn't really, I don't think he necessarily kicks Hook off himself. I think ultimately Hook sort of plays into his own downfall in the Disney version, and you'll kind of maybe see that as that happens. And basically, even though in the original work it says Hook is Eden, Hook is not necessarily Eden in the Disney version. I don't think they wanted to keep it that gruesome. And again, Disney kind of really goes for a comedy, slapstick, violence type thing, because I didn't think they wanted to take Peter Pan too seriously, unlike the 2003 version where it's a little bit more darker. In this, it's very lighthearted in the sense that, you know, Hook falls, but the crocodile's still kind of chasing him, and all the other pirates are kind of trying to, you know, leave as well as and abandon the ship. And, you know, as they're doing so, they kind of are chasing for Captain Hook so they can somehow maybe rescue him and whatnot. But we don't really know what happens to Hook in the end. It's kind of like one of those things we don't know, unlike the play, which kind of makes this whole point of, yeah, he's dead. So there's that. And then ultimately at the end, Peter Pan takes the ship back to London, basically similar to the way the Disney version plays itself out, where Mary Darling agrees to adopt the lost boy. She offers to adopt Peter as well, but Peter is afraid of becoming a man. There's a hint that Mary Darling knew Peter when she was young, but it is not made clear. Finally, Peter promises Wendy that he will return every spring, and Wendy prays that Peter will not forget his promise. Somewhat different in the Disney version. Yes, Peter Pan ultimately brings everybody back. He doesn't really bring the Lost Boys back. Just brings back the Darling family. It is emphasized sort of in the Disney version that the Lost Boys kind of want to go home, but we don't really see that really fully pursued out in the Disney version, which I found interesting, and I didn't really understand why they didn't do that. But for the most part, basically the Darlings, they are sent back home, and for the most part there isn't, I think it's hinted sort of towards the beginning that Mrs. Darling is more open to the idea of Peter Pan, but it's not really hinted as to if she believes he exists. I think she just kind of understands that it's like sort of a childlike fantasy and is more accepting of that idea than like Mr. Darling, who's more of the practical man. But I don't think the Disney version really tries to hint at that. But what I find fascinating about the Disney version is it actually hints upon the father, actually, towards the end. And at the end you'll see how he looks out and he's like, there's a ship. And he's like, I think I saw that ship, you know, a very, very long time ago. And I think that's really an ultimate kind of change within his character that we didn't really see towards the beginning. And how ultimately this journey that the three kids had sort of maybe, I think, changed him in a way in remembering the time when he was a kid. And I find that really sweet. And how he has that sort of like nostalgic feeling, and you'll kind of see this in the Disney version. So I thought that was fascinating that the father of all people saw something and said, you know what, that really does look familiar. You know, it's like something I've seen when I was a kid. So it may be sort of an indulgence of his childlike fantasy as well. And I think the whole point of Peter Pan is supposed to be it technically is a fantasy. And also there's no promise made in the Disney version. Peter Pan doesn't promise to return or anything. He just sends them back, and that's pretty much it. And you know, you're just left with that. The kids are just left with that one experience, and that's how it sort of ends in the Disney version. Now, as far as characters are concerned, Peter Pan's character is probably fairly similar in both versions. You know, he's cocky, he's everything that, you know, a young boy would probably be. Very self-centered, sure of himself. But I think the Disney version plays him off as a little bit more judgmental and pompous, I would say, than in the original work. And there's also a sense in the original work that he's really afraid to grow up. It's not that he's very, I guess, judgmental about growing up. It's just he's afraid to embrace it. I think he's just he doesn't really want to take that leap. He would rather be within the confines of being a kid and not be really forced to change. And I think this emphasizes it well in the play when, like, Wendy sort of questions her feelings for him and asks him, like, how do you feel about me? And he kind of responds like a mom. And the thing is since Wendy's growing up and she's dealing with things like puberty, you know, hint, hint, you know, it's that idea of Peter Pan can't grow up and he won't be able to experience more adult-like emotions like love or any of those things because he hasn't been able to go through that whole change and that whole process. Whereas Wendy is changing and her emotions are sort of changing into the way she sees him, but his emotions don't change. And I think, again, he's sort of a symbol of, again, sort of that fear of change. His character is afraid of altering himself and becoming something else. And I think that's identifiable for kids, because I think some kids may be actually afraid of growing up. Other kids may actually want to grow up. For them, I'm in more of the category of, as a kid, I always wanted to grow up. I mean, I always wanted to be independent, and but I can really understand why this would, in particular, Peter Pan's story may appeal to a lot of adults, because I think a lot of adults want to get younger again, if they could, probably. But there's also sort of, you know, like these limits as to, you know, how you perceive things. Because Wendy's character can evolve her feelings, but Peter can't evolve his feelings. He's left in that state of childhood, and that childhood innocence of understanding, and doesn't see beyond that. But Wendy is changing because she doesn't see things just as a kid. She sees things more of an adult perspective. So that's really, I think, what's more emphasized in his character in the book than really in the Disney version. I think the Disney version tries to play him out as kind of cocky and judgmental, and you know, at times, you know, especially with the mermaid scene, and in the Disney version where he takes Wendy to see the mermaids, you know, you kind of go, yeah, that's probably typical, you know, behavior of somebody who doesn't really grow up or who becomes civilized, and someone who doesn't really understand, you know, these doesn't take things seriously. And you'll see how Peter Pan's character does not take things seriously at all, because I mean, he's a kid. He lives in a fantasy-like world, so it wouldn't make sense. So for the most part, it's sort of similar, I'd say, for the most part. But again, you'll kind of see how Disney kind of takes it maybe a little bit step more in the sense of him being sort of a projection of the time period. Something about that, you know, that 50s kind of maybe mentality is probably shown in Peter's character in the original 1953 Disney version, but in the story, you feel like he's just this character just doesn't want to change, doesn't want to accept that, and is genuinely afraid of growing up. But in the Disney version, I don't think it's more he doesn't want to grow up in the sense that he's afraid of it. It's just, I think he just wants to be free from responsibility and doesn't want to really take on these adult-like things, but not necessarily because he's afraid of it. I don't think in the Disney version it gives a sense at all that he's afraid of growing up. I just think he's just, he's a cocky kid. He doesn't want to take responsibility. He doesn't want to evolve. And he wants everything to be about him. And I think a lot of what we get from childhood selfishness is from that idea that, we are kids and we don't really need to take responsibility because we're kids and we don't really understand responsibility and we live in our kind of own fantasy world. And that's why we often don't blame kids a lot of the time if they do something wrong. I mean, we do blame kids when they do something wrong, but we don't take it in the same sense as when an adult does it. So, again, I think the Disney version tries to emphasize that more, than emphasizing the idea of, oh, he's afraid to grow up, which is what's clearly put in the play. Wendy's character is practically the same for the most part. I'd say that for the most part she is the same, but I think in the Disney work she is given a more active role to do. In particular, when she kind of is more authoritative with the Lost Boys and with her two brothers. You'll see this when she decides to ultimately walk the plank because she doesn't want to be a pirate, and she doesn't want to change sides, and she gives justifications for it, and she's very intelligent. She's probably one of the strong Disney girls, and it's clearly shown in the Disney version, especially when she stands up to the mermaids as well. There are scenes where they do try to make her seem like she is trying to do stuff, while at the same time having this kind of innocent, proper kind of personality that you would probably see in a child of her age during the time, maybe. But she is given, I think, a more active role than in the original play, even though the original play plays her out as to be the ultimate protagonist of the play. And as far as her other brothers are concerned, I think Michael and John, they kind of they have more, I think, time specifically with Peter Pan in the play than they do in the Disney work, because again, Disney has that kind of separation, and then they don't come back together until a certain point, towards the middle and towards the middle end. So, but you'll see how if you just decide to research more into the play, you will realize that John doesn't really ultimately always agree with Peter Pan all the time, and Michael is fairly young as well, and for the most part I think they're played out as like John, yes, is kind of the smart one and Michael is kind of the young innocent one, but I think the play gives them maybe a little bit more prominence than maybe the Disney version does, just because that they have these sort of more interactions with Peter Pan. So I think that's really all I can say about the Darlings for the most part. And then Mr. and Mrs. Darling are fairly the same. Miss Darling being more open to the idea of Peter Pan and all these concepts and all these concepts about Peter Pan, and the dad being a little bit more the practical one who's kind of going, yeah, that's all just poppycock, and he literally says in the Disney version, poppycock. But I like how in the Disney version he sort of changes, and you'll kind of see that towards the end. Even though it is very brief, I still think, like, in both versions, I mean, the Disney version may play him out as more of a jerk, but I don't really think he is. I think he was just really stressed out, and I think it's very understandable that, you know, a father would be stressed out when he wants to have a good standing with his family, and having to be stressed out about his job, and it's a very practical situation. I mean, and the way Disney plays it out is, I think, very realistic in the sense of, you know, the dad wanting to make sure, you know, everything is kept in order, and, you know, that there's not much attention drawn to his family that can be portrayed in a negative light. So it is understandable that in both versions he would be this more practical man who wouldn't really be for the idea of fairy tales and fantasies, and would be more of the idea of, you know, being practical like him, and embracing more of adulthood and responsibility. So, for the most part, I do understand that the character is a little bit more forceful in the Disney version as him being, you know, stressed out, but I think that was just because we only see this one scene where he's just really stressed out to going to this particular kind of party or social event that they have to go to the Disney version. That he may come off as a little bit jerky, but for the most part, I think it may be understandable, and you kind of understand. The Disney version actually kind of explains a little bit, you know, this is so and so, and he's a little bit more practical, so he's not like the rest of his family. So again, this is obviously what would cause a lot of quarrel, a lot of disagreement. So I don't think he really was a jerk in the Disney version. I just think that he had a lot of stress on his plate, and I think it would be understandable that he would react maybe in the way that he does. So I think that's really all I can say about that. As far as Tinkerbell, pretty much the same thing. Spoiled, self-centered, and very jealous. Jealous of Wendy. Again, you'll see that she does kind of play into that role of jealousy. And I thought this was interesting, though, because in the original work it says that her size allows her to only display one emotion. So the fact that she's so compressed and so small, she's only capable of experiencing like anger or jealousy or one emotion. It's not like her brain is capable of having different emotions, maybe like we could. And I thought that was interesting. And also, she said in the original work to be in charge of mending pots and kettles, and like an actual tinker. So, you know, Tinkerbell, that's how you get Tinkerbell's name, from the fact that she tinkers stuff. So that I found to be interesting. But for the most part, her character's fairly structured in the same way. Yeah, she's portrayed as just like, and she does have like a tinker with her, with when she flies around, like how they do with sort of the Disney version, and making her sort of like this just small fairy who's, yeah, very, very jealous, and it's the same thing in the original work. Now I think Captain Hook's fairly interesting. In the original work, he wants to kill Peter Pan because of his cockiness and the fact that he'll drive gentle pirates to madness. That's how it sort of explains it, as to his motivations as to getting rid of Peter Pan and wanting to basically kill him. Instead of, you know, it is said in the original work that he did, you know, cut off his arm, or like his hand, and fed it to the crocodile, but at the same time, he doesn't, for the most part, I believe he doesn't really want to kill him because of that. He wants to rid him because of his personality. And I think that personality has to do with the fact that, you know, Captain Hook is this sort of more adult-like figure. He's not a childlike figure. And it's sort of this, we sort of see this clash between adulthood and childhood, I think. In particular with Captain Hook and Peter Pan. And, you know, basically, I think he just wants to drive Peter Pan away because his personality doesn't bring out the best in the things that surround Captain Hook in particular. And I think that would be understandable because Peter Pan is this sort of, you know, cocky person, and, you know, Captain Hook sort of sees him as a jerk and wants to really destroy him for that reason. But in the Disney version, it's more, I think, about the fact that, you know, not really about Peter Pan's personality, but more about Peter Pan, you know, cutting off his arm, feeding it to the crocodile. You know, that is something that was really, you know, just, it really made him, I think, really angry in the Disney version. You'll clearly see this, you know, when he's sort of introduced in the beginning, you really see how this kind of tragic event dealing with the crocodile really affected him to the point where he's almost really wimpy, and you'll get sort of this really hilarious type character in the Disney version. I don't think he's really intended for comedy so much in the play, but in the Disney version they do really play out this idea that he is kind of comedic, and yeah, it's really pretty much the same character, but just different, more hinted on different motivations. I mean, it's not like in the Disney version that he thinks the great Peter Pan's like the greatest thing in the world. I mean, I think he does think Peter Pan is ultimately really a jerk. And you kind of do sympathize with Captain Hook at times. I mean, I did remember, for the most part, me kind of sympathizing with him now as being more of an adult and understanding, you know, how cocky and how, you know, how Peter Pan can maybe have a little bit of an annoyance factor onto his character. And why Captain Hook would want to be rid of that. Another character that I found to be really interesting was Mr. Smee. Now, in case you don't know, Mr. Smee is basically Captain Hook's sort of other pirate, sort of second-hand pirate that is more prominent in both versions. But in the original version, he's a nonconformist, and he was the only man Hook ever feared. Totally different in the Disney version. In the Disney version, he is played out for sheer laughs, and he is hilarious in the Disney version, let me tell you. But the thing is that he's played out as more dumb and peaceful-like. He's not, you know, somebody that Hook fears. You know, he's someone that Hook messes with constantly because because sometimes, or Smee actually messes with him unintentionally at times, which leads to a lot of funny parts. But you will see that Smee is just more this lighthearted, bubbly, nice guy in the Disney version, but not really in the original work, as you can see from what I've read off to you. He's kind of not like that. I personally think the Disney version allows it to be a little bit more entertaining, but that's basically the main profound difference. Smee is more used for comedy rather than being a serious character. So, serious character, original work. Funny, bubbly, nice, stupid guy. Disney. So that's really all I think I can say about Mr. Smee's character. Now, last thing I think I should mention that's really important is the mermaids. Pretty much the same thing, like I've said, sort of towards the plot, but the difference is that they actually have sort of a more, I think, sort of maybe a more childlike maybe approach, and a sinister childlike approach to dealing with other people besides Peter Pan, because in the original tale it's kind of they're not really emphasized so much, but they're there. But in in the Disney work, we do actually get a scene where Wendy is basically sort of being forced by them to, drown, basically. Like, they try to force her to go swim, and basically they just want to drown her. That's ultimately what they want to do. And literally one of the mermaids comes out and says it, "We're only trying to drown her." She literally just says, like, yeah, that's what we want to do. We really want to kill people, and that's literally what the mermaids are supposed to be and intended to do in the original work as well. They don't like anybody else but Peter Pan. And you'll kind of see how Peter Pan comes off as like sort of a real jerk in that scene in the Disney version. But for the most part, the mermaids are kind of played out in the same way. They're like these, I think, I'm not sure how they were intended to look like in the original work, but what I can say is for how they look like in the Disney version is totally, don't judge a book by its cover, because these mermaids are just pretty, like really, really pretty, but they're just really, 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 they're just kind of more on the sort of snooty side. But I think that the original work was trying to take them as to be more threatening. And I think in the Disney work, they were just trying to be snooty. Like, oh yeah, we were really going to drown her, They just kind of play it off like it's kind of kid-like, I think, in a sense, where they don't really know what they're doing. They just want to mess with her because they can, because they're mermaids. And they don't have, like, any powers or, like, trying to seduce people, but they just do mess with her in that kind of way where it's amusing, but they don't really come off as the most likable, and it's the same thing with the original. They don't really come off as really likable. You won't really find Ariel here, even though maybe some people don't even really particularly find Ariel to be that likable, but I personally would take her over those mermaids any day of the week. But for the most part, I think that's really all I can say about Peter Pan. The play does have some prominence and does have some resonance, and J.M. Barrie has done several different works. There was actually a work before this where I think it does try to incorporate Peter Pan a bit, but doesn't really fully emphasize him, unlike the next book that he writes, which was based on Peter Pan. But overall, I think the most important thing that you have to get out of is that these are two different mediums. Again, one being animation, the other being like this idea and perspective on childhood, and I think it's really interesting to have it in the form of a play. And there's been like tons of musicals and tons of different things based upon Peter Pan. The Disney version is not just the only one out there. Is it a solid version? I believe so. I think it does try to remain sort of true to the work of J.M. Barrie and capture the essence sort of J.M. Barrie's a bit. But I think it's just the mediums where people may have different feelings or different repercussions from one or the other because they're just told through a different perspective. Because movies and animation are different than just a stage play production. So, yeah, I think that's really all I can say. And any questions, comments, concerns, I'm more than happy to answer them. But I think that's really all I can say about Peter Pan, is that ultimately everything really plays out in the same. It's sort of just structured differently. And some things are maybe a little bit more prominent than others, but for the most part they're both decent versions. I'll put links below to all of the things where you can sort of check out the summaries and all that good stuff. And until next time, bye bye everybody.